After my Resident Evil video, and while I finish tackling the Resident Evil 4 remake, which I'm doing an entirely separate video on next, I got thinking about what makes a good horror game. Is it creature design, isolation, the fear of what lurks in the darkness? Probably all of those things, to be fair. Obviously there's some fundamentally important things, the basics. Game difficulty, setting and technical details like lighting and visuals all need to be appropriate in order to bring immersion and believability to the world. Horror can also be subjective, of course. What scares one person may not necessarily scare another. But on a deeper level, beneath the things that are no-brainers, what elements can help make a game truly frightening? How do you develop a gripping atmosphere, immerse players into the game and build suspense? I decided to dive back into some of my other horror classics to see if I can answer this question, from my perspective at least, with a few examples of what the games do well to demonstrate my thinking. The examples are in no particular order. Again, this is my opinion only. Feel free to debate and discuss in the comments section. So, sound design may seem like one of the fundamentals, but I'm always interested by the different ways it's utilised in horror. There's no underestimating just how important it is, not least the sound effects of the environment you're actually in, which helps to build the believability I mentioned.
Christ.
If the world is believable, you become more immersed in the atmosphere and obviously you'll be more committed and therefore reactive to what is going on. Dead Space is an example of how the environment alone is immediately a threatening place, with the manic whispering voices calling the character's name, the clanging of metal in the distance, sometimes just walking into a room and getting a deafening blast of machinery, combined with flashing lights and other visual tricks. The game has built a feeling of unease without a single enemy being in sight. The particular noises that enemies make then further enhances what is created by a game's setting. Not just that, but when you hear them. A specific moment that always sticks out for me is this noise.
Can't hide from it. It's coming.
That doesn't sound like any of the other ones.
Walls won't stop it. Doors won't stop it. Nothing will.
This leans towards the paranormal, which personally I've always found scarier than zombies or monsters. On the recording, it's the singing ghost that you come across during optional encounters called anima. Suspense and dread are built from the fact that you hear about this thing through diaries and logs, warning you about something deadly that you haven't even seen yet. The fact you don't know what it is, only that the noise it makes clearly suggests it probably isn't going to be good, incites a nervous curiosity. You're thinking, I have to find out what this thing is, even though I don't really want to. Building tension in this way is also achievable through music.
Jesus, stay back!
The Tyrant in the Resident Evil 2 remake is accompanied by a really weird, unsettling piece of music which increases the tension already created by his stomping footsteps and the sound of him opening and closing doors. But just as gripping as music is the absence of music, like in Resident Evil 1, where the music suddenly cuts out and all you can hear instead is scratching sounds coming from a door that you can't see, forcing you to walk towards it, changing the camera angle to reveal what's making the noise. It's a common horror trope that what you can't see is often scarier than what you can, and hearing something before you see it is an ideal way for a horror game to pull this off.
You'll never know how I feel until you've lost your family.
I never had a family to lose.
Building on my point about world immersion, my next element is about characters and narrative. Context behind what you are doing in a game is important. Making you care about what's happening develops a personal connection, and without that you have no real reason to carry on if you hit a really rough patch. Scary can still be scary on its own, sure, but without fleshing it out and putting meat on the bones, no pun intended, it just becomes one-dimensional, kinda like a jump scare. We can look at the first Evil Within as an example. The original story was good but complicated, told in a really funny way, and also hindered by dry, dull characters. Sebastian was a wooden protagonist with no charisma. If you're not really empathising with the characters, especially who you're playing as, you have no real connection with their struggle. The sequel, Evil Within 2, recognised this, exceeding my expectations with its renewed movie-quality focus on storytelling and emphasis on character development. Not only was the story told in a more chronological way, but Sebastian is now a fully fleshed out character, with dynamic and developing relationships with his wife and daughter and those around him. That gives the horror a more personal edge. You're committed to helping him find his daughter, to see what happens, rather than just doing it because the game tells you you've got to do it. Going back to the ghost, Anima, she's scary on her own, sure, because of her jerky, unnatural animation, her singing, the music, But you find out later that Anima is a manifestation of the trauma Sebastian went through in the first game. He's being haunted by his own memories. The horror is therefore twofold, working on a personal level, not just a visual or audible one. It's a similar concept to the bent neck lady in the Haunting of Hill House Netflix series. She's freaky enough on screen before you have any context, but what leaves a lasting impression and really messed me up is who the ghost is, why she exists. That's when the true horror comes in. In a video game, this can also help with making you feel unease because it taps into your sense of pity or empathy, throwing your emotions off a bit by providing complexity to your fear and disgust. I think that's just as effective, maybe even more so, than an enemy or character that is just bad and wants to kill you simply by choice or natural instinct. And this links somewhat into the next element I'm going to talk about.
Listen. Can you hear it? It's coming.
Unpredictability and facing the unknown works especially well for advanced enemies later in a game, ones that you can't kill with your conventional weapons, or even those ones that can't be killed at all. To use the Evil Within as another example, Laura appears multiple times. Your guns, which have protected you right up to this point, are now useless, forcing you to play tactically using the environment or alternative methods to get away or progress. Sequences where you play as a character in a game that can't fight back at all can also be effective if utilised in moderation and with the right pacing. Playing as Sherry, for example, in the orphanage in Resident Evil 2 Remake is great, because the shift in dynamic means that the player no longer knows exactly what to expect. They thought they knew what they were doing and that they had things under control, settling into a bit of a rhythm. Then the rug gets pulled out from under their feet. The original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis did this really well too, because the police station, while not a safe place, was at least a familiar one where you could feel somewhat comfortable, until you realised the Nemesis could come through doors, giving a familiar environment a new level of danger. Unpredictability can also help replace the unknown. The first time you play a game, obviously you don't know what to expect, unless it's a remake, potentially, but what happens on your third or fourth playthrough once you know what's going to happen? Enemy variety in design and behaviour, and unpredictability are a way to force you to constantly be aware of your surroundings every time you play. Dead Space achieved this by using the vents as different spawn points which were linked to where your character actually was, but you still didn't really know when or where a necromorph was going to come bursting out. Let's take a look at another example, and you'll see what I mean. In Condemned, the AI will do different things if you replay the same area. I went into an area during one of my playthroughs and I could hear an enemy coughing somewhere in the room. He ran out from behind a wall and I was killed in the ensuing fight. When I reloaded the game and came back to the area, there was total silence. I thought the game may have glitched or not loaded properly, but the enemy this time was standing to my left pretending to be one of the mannequins, and I totally shit myself. If you know what's coming in a horror game, it does lose its effectiveness after the first playthrough, as you become desensitized. But unpredictability is a good way to counteract that and ensure that the game retains replay value. I talked about limited resources quite a lot in my last video, but it's amazing how much more stressful a game can be when you know that every bullet and health item counts. If you can just blast your way through everything, the horror is gone because you're too powerful. As much as I absolutely love games like BioShock, The Darkness and Doom, the horror elements aren't truly scary due to the fact that you're pretty much an all-conquering badass in all of them. To be fair, I don't think these games are meant to be that scary, certainly not in the same way as survival horror. But a survival horror game is not just about limiting your health and ammo to increase your feeling of vulnerability. It's about the relief you feel when you do find that additional gun, health pack or piece of ammo that you so desperately needed. This leads to something I think is important in this regard: balance. Brief moments of respite are needed to provide a false sense of calm, so the next time you encounter something horrifying or have to move on, it has the same impact or similar that it did the first couple of times. Going too far in the other direction, and just giving you absolutely no power for the entire game, means that you're on edge all the time, and you could well end up turning the game off because you just can't play it for long, or worse, again, become desensitized to the horror to the point that it loses its potency and could even become frustrating. This is why I appreciate games like Outlast and Amnesia, but can never really get into them. Yeah, basically what I'm saying is that I'm just a bit of a baby. But a balance between all-out badassery and having no power whatsoever allows the dread to start rebuilding after a moment of respite, so you feel nervous anticipation of what's coming next. Going back to Condemned again, this is a game that balanced this stuff really well. Its focus on melee combat made you feel only slightly in control at all times. You'd only really be in full control with a gun, if you managed to find one, which was exciting, but the gun would only ever have a handful of bullets. Once they were gone, you could still defend yourself using the empty gun, but it would disintegrate in your hand. It was like waving a breadstick around compared to the pipe, axe or crowbar you likely threw away to pick it up in the first place. All of a sudden you've gone from a position of power to being badly exposed in a heartbeat. All this leads into combat strategy and a need to be sensible with the resources you do find, adding to tension, and this is something I talked about extensively in the Resident Evil series.
You need help.
Why?
He's right behind you.
What?
Sometimes what you need after all that building of suspense and dread is an all-out panic. Chase sequences, especially while having to focus on completing additional tasks, is one of my favourite elements in a horror game. Usually these are linked with enemies that can't be killed with conventional weaponry, like I mentioned earlier. Chase sequences, while kinda cheap at times, can be a really good way to prolong the fear you feel when something happens, rather than say a jump scare which is pretty short-lived and the adrenaline dies down quickly afterwards. The regenerating necromorphs in the Dead Space series are a perfect example of this. You have to slow them down while running away or fighting other enemies, or maneuver them into a specific position in order to finally fight back, forcing you to multitask. You have no choice but to hurry up, and that makes it exciting. This also links to my previous point about Laura from Evil Within 1 and 2. Figuring out how to escape an area that she's in, but also executing those steps and avoiding a creature that can kill you in one hit is a great way to mix things up a bit and keep the horror varied and fresh. It's a similar situation with the Keeper as well. Cool enemy, really freaky, and reminds me of the Pyramid Heads from Silent Hill. This might sound a bit weird, but the panic from chase sequences like these reminds me a bit of going swimming. Have you ever been messing around while waist deep in water and your mate starts chasing you? You know that you're in no real danger, but it's still terrifying because you have to work hard to get away. You don't want to get caught, even though you know there's no consequence really if you do. This is what these sequences in horror games replicate, and why horror overall works so well, tapping into emotions that we don't normally experience from the comfort of our homes. So in addition to the basics, those are my main principles that I think all contribute to a successful horror video game experience. Sound design, character and narrative, the unknown and unpredictability, limited resources and inventory management, and a good old chase sequence or two, preferably with an unkillable enemy, all brought together with the right balance. There are other things that all contribute as well. Jump scares certainly have their place if used sparingly, as well as darkness and limited vision, good enemy design, and a decent amount of body horror and blood and guts for good measure. Gore itself isn't really that scary, it's more of a shock value thing. Call it icing on the cake rather than the cake itself. What do you think are the most important things in a horror game? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.